It was a bright morning, the kind that made flying feel peaceful. The airport was alive with the usual sounds, rolling suitcases, murmuring voices, and the faint echo of boarding announcements. People were excited, some traveling for business, others heading to see loved ones. Among the passengers boarding Flight 227 was a man in his late 30s. He carried a small backpack and looked calm, almost too calm for someone about to board a plane. He had a gentle face, a few faint lines of worry around his eyes, and the kind of presence that made him seem dependable without even trying. He wasn't a frequent flyer, but he wasn't nervous either. To him, this flight was just another step toward something personal. He was on his way to visit his sister after nearly 7 years apart. As passengers found their seats, flight attendants greeted everyone with polite smiles. Families settled in. Children looked out the windows with excitement, and the air felt lighthearted. The man took his seat near the front, placed his bag beneath the seat, and looked out at the bright sky. It was clear, not a cloud in sight. He couldn't help but feel a quiet comfort as the engine started to hum. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot were going through their usual routine. The captain was a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in the air. His calm tone and steady hands were the kind that made even new co-pilots feel secure. He chatted casually as they prepared for takeoff, joking about how smooth the flight was expected to be. Within minutes, the plane taxied down the runway and lifted off gracefully. The passengers clapped softly as they ascended, the sunlight streaming through the windows like golden ribbons. The man by the window smiled to himself, feeling the familiar push of gravity as the city below began to shrink into a patchwork of colors. A soft announcement came over the speakers. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We're flying at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and the weather looks perfect for our flight today. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your journey." The voice was confident, smooth, exactly what everyone expected from a captain. The passengers relaxed. Some opened books, some put on headphones, while a few closed their eyes to rest. Flight attendants began moving down the aisle with carts of drinks and snacks. The man near the front thanked the attendant with a quiet smile and sipped his coffee slowly. There was something calming about the steady sound of the engines, like a heartbeat in the background. For the first hour, everything went exactly as planned. The plane cruised smoothly through the clear blue sky. Children giggled a few rows back. An elderly couple quietly shared a sandwich, and two businessmen talked about their upcoming meeting. It was ordinary in every sense, ordinary and peaceful, but peace can be fragile. Sometimes it only takes a second for everything to change. It began with something small. The captain, who had been speaking to the co-pilot, suddenly paused mid-sentence. His voice trailed off, and he blinked several times as if trying to shake off a wave of dizziness. The co-pilot noticed but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just tired. But then the captain's hand slipped off the control. His breathing became uneven. "Are you okay?" the co-pilot asked quickly, turning to look at him. No answer. The captain's eyes rolled back slightly, and before the co-pilot could react, the man slumped forward onto the controls. The autopilot button clicked off accidentally, and the plane tilted ever so slightly to one side. The co-pilot's heart started pounding. He tried shaking the captain's shoulder, calling his name again, but there was no response. The man was completely unconscious. Panic began to rise in his throat, but training took over. He pulled the yoke back gently to stabilize the plane, switched on the autopilot again, and grabbed the radio. "Mayday, mayday. This is Flight 227, he said, voice shaking. "Captain is unresponsive. Request immediate medical assistance on board." Out in the cabin, the passengers felt a light jolt. Nothing too alarming at first, just enough to make a few people look up. The man by the window glanced toward the aisle, curious. He noticed one of the flight attendants whispering into her headset, her expression suddenly serious. Moments later, the intercom crackled. The same calm voice was replaced by a nervous one. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there's a doctor or medical professional on board, please press your call button immediately. We have a medical situation in the cockpit." The words sent a wave of murmurs through the cabin. People looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. The flight attendants hurried down the aisle, their smiles gone now, replaced by a focused urgency. A woman in her 40s wearing a nurse's badge from the hospital she worked at stood up. "I'm a nurse," she said. One of the attendants quickly guided her toward the front. The man by the window watched her go, his heart beginning to race. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him told him this wasn't just a minor issue. Inside the cockpit, the nurse quickly checked the captain's pulse. "He's breathing, but it's weak," she said firmly. "He's out cold. We need to keep him stable." The co-pilot nodded, trying to hide the fear in his voice as he spoke to air traffic control again. "We have a medical emergency involving the captain. I'm maintaining control for now." Back in the cabin, turbulence began to shake the plane slightly. It wasn't severe, but enough to make passengers grab their armrests. A few children started to cry. The man near the front took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. He'd flown enough times to know that turbulence happened, but this felt different. The attendants were whispering now, their faces pale. Another jolt came, sharper this time. A drink spilled from a tray. The man's coffee sloshed over the edge of his cup. The sound of worried voices filled the air. "Is everything okay?" someone asked loudly from the back. One of the attendants forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Everything is under control," she said softly. But her trembling hands told another story. The man looked toward the cockpit door, which was slightly ajar. Through the small gap, he caught a glimpse of the nurse leaning over the captain, checking his breathing while the co-pilot handled the controls alone. The co-pilot's face was tense, his jaw clenched. The man felt something stir inside him. A mix of fear and something else, a strange pull to help. He didn't know why, but his instincts wouldn't let him sit still. Another 10 minutes passed. The turbulence grew worse. The plane dipped slightly before leveling again. Gasps echoed through the cabin. The co-pilot's voice came over the speakers, calm but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Everything will be fine," but his tone didn't sound fine. It sounded like someone trying very hard not to lose control. The man leaned back in his seat, trying to think clearly. He had taken flying lessons years ago. Nothing serious, just a hobby he once loved but never pursued. He knew enough to understand that a pilot fainting midair was no small thing. The co-pilot could manage the plane, sure, but if anything else went wrong, things could spiral quickly. He looked around at the other passengers, families clutching each other's hands, people whispering prayers, a child hiding her face in her mother's shoulder. Fear spread like a quiet ripple, invisible but powerful. He clenched his hands together and whispered under his breath, "Please, let them land this plane safely." The nurse came out briefly from the cockpit to grab a first aid kit. Her expression was tight, eyes darting toward the ceiling as if calculating every second. She spoke quickly to a flight attendant, who nodded and disappeared toward the back to retrieve oxygen equipment. "Is the captain going to be okay?" a woman near the front asked. "We're doing everything we can," the nurse said gently, before disappearing back into the cockpit. The man exhaled slowly. The hum of the engine suddenly felt louder, almost deafening. He tried to calm his thoughts, but something in his gut told him this flight was about to become anything but ordinary. Outside the windows, the clouds were beginning to thicken. The bright blue sky faded to a pale gray. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed somewhere ahead. Passengers began whispering again. "Did they say what happened? Is the pilot okay? What's going on?" The man didn't answer anyone. His eyes stayed fixed on that small cockpit door, waiting, listening. He couldn't help but think, what if things got worse? What if the co-pilot couldn't handle it alone? He remembered the basics from his old lessons, how the instruments worked, the feel of the yoke, the sound of the engines when you adjusted the throttle. The memories came back like flickering flashes of light in a storm. He never imagined they'd mean anything years later. The plane suddenly dipped again. This time, a few passengers screamed. Trays rattled, and someone's bag fell from the overhead compartment. The seatbelt sign glowed red above them. The man's heart pounded. He glanced at the window. The horizon tilted slightly, then leveled out. The co-pilot must have corrected it, but for how long could he keep control alone? As the murmurs and fear grew inside the cabin, the man made a decision deep inside himself. If things continued to get worse, he wouldn't sit still. He would help somehow, no matter what it took. For now, he just sat there quietly, watching the clouds swallow the sunlight outside, unaware that his calm determination would soon change the fate of everyone on board. And as the storm rolled closer, no one yet knew that this flight, this ordinary, peaceful morning journey, was about to become the story of a lifetime. The cabin was no longer calm. The light chatter that once filled the air had faded, replaced by uneasy silence and short, nervous whispers. The sound of the engines continued steadily, but to everyone inside it suddenly felt louder, heavier, as if the entire plane knew something was wrong. The man near the front kept looking toward the cockpit door. It had been nearly 20 minutes since the announcement asking for medical help. No one had said anything since. The passengers waited for news, hoping someone would come over the intercom to tell them everything was fine. But no one did. The co-pilot sat in the cockpit, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were tight on the controls. He was doing everything he could to keep the plane steady. The sky ahead was beginning to darken with clouds, and the air felt rougher than before. Every time the plane shook, he glanced nervously toward the unconscious captain lying beside him. The nurse beside the captain was still checking his pulse, her forehead shining with sweat. "He's breathing," she said quietly. "But it's shallow. We need to land soon." The co-pilot nodded, his throat dry. "I'm trying to contact air traffic control. They're clearing a route, but we're still a long way from the nearest airport." He switched the radio and called again. "This is Flight 227. The captain is unresponsive. I'm the co-pilot. We need immediate priority landing clearance." A calm voice came through the static. "Copy that, Flight 227. Stay steady on your current heading. We're coordinating with emergency services. Can you maintain control?" The co-pilot took a shaky breath. "For now, yes, but I'll need assistance. The weather's getting rough." The man in the cabin could sense that something wasn't right. The plane gave another small shake, and a few passengers gasped. A child began to cry softly. The man turned toward the window, watching the clouds grow thicker. He had flown before. He knew this wasn't normal turbulence. Something serious was happening up front. One of the flight attendants rushed down the aisle, her face pale but composed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said softly, trying to sound calm, "please keep your seatbelts fastened and stay seated. We are handling a situation in the cockpit and everything is under control." But it didn't feel under control. The man could see the fear hiding behind her forced smile. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think. His old flying lessons from years ago echoed in his memory. The feel of the controls, the sound of the radio, the rhythm of the plane. He hadn't thought about any of it in so long. Yet at that moment, those memories returned sharper than ever. The turbulence worsened. The plane tilted slightly to one side before leveling out again. A few passengers gasped, clutching the armrests. The man opened his eyes and looked toward the cockpit again. He couldn't see much through the narrow gap in the door, but the sound of hurried voices carried faintly through. Inside, the co-pilot's situation was growing more desperate. The storm ahead was closing in faster than expected. Rain clouds stretched across their route, and the radar screen was lighting up with patches of turbulence. The nurse was still kneeling beside the captain, holding an oxygen mask over his face. "We're losing altitude," the co-pilot muttered, adjusting the throttle. "Come on, stay with me." The radio crackled again. "Flight 227, we're seeing your altitude drop. Are you declaring a full emergency?" "Yes," the co-pilot replied, his voice shaking now. "Declaring a full emergency, requesting assistance." In the cabin, the fastened seatbelt light blinked again, followed by a short tone. The man looked around as worried voices filled the air. "What's going on?" someone asked. Another passenger muttered a prayer under their breath. The flight attendants moved quickly, securing loose items, speaking softly to passengers, telling them everything would be okay. But fear had already spread like smoke through the plane. The man couldn't take it anymore. He stood up slowly, even as a flight attendant gestured for him to sit back down. "Sir, please remain seated," she said. "I know," he replied calmly, "but I need to help. I used to take flying lessons." She blinked, unsure how to respond. "Sir, the pilots are handling it." "Please," he said, his voice low and steady. "I'm not trying to interfere. Just let them know. Maybe I can help." The look in his eyes wasn't of panic. It was steady, focused, the kind of look people have when they know what they're doing. The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded and hurried to the cockpit. Inside, the co-pilot was trying to steady the plane again. He looked exhausted. His hands trembled slightly as he wiped sweat from his forehead. When the attendant leaned in and spoke quietly, he turned to look at her. "A passenger says he has some flying experience," she said softly. "He wants to help." The co-pilot hesitated for a second, then looked at the radar again. The storm was getting closer. The captain was still unconscious. He didn't have much of a choice. "Bring him in," he said. Moments later, the man stepped into the cockpit. The space was tight, filled with blinking lights, switches, and the low hum of machinery. The co-pilot looked at him with wary eyes. "You said you've flown before?" The co-pilot asked quickly. "Only small planes," the man replied honestly, "but I remember the basics. I can follow instructions." The co-pilot nodded. "Okay, I might need your help reading instruments and communicating with control." The man took a deep breath and nodded. "Tell me what to do." He slipped into the seat behind the co-pilot, eyes scanning the controls. The sight was overwhelming. Rows of buttons, dials, and displays, but some of it looked familiar. The sound of the engines, the rhythm of the instruments, it all came back slowly. "Flight 227, confirm your situation," came the voice from the radio again. "This is the co-pilot," he replied. "Captain is unconscious. Passenger assisting. We're stabilizing the aircraft. Copy that 227, we're going to talk you through everything. You're doing great. Keep your heading steady. You're cleared for emergency landing at Cityport International. Weather reports show moderate turbulence ahead. Expect rough air." The man took a deep breath as the plane shook again. He kept his eyes on the horizon ahead. "We can do this," he said quietly, mostly to himself. The co-pilot gave him a quick glance and nodded. "I hope you're right." Meanwhile, the nurse kept working on the captain, checking his pulse and monitoring his breathing. She looked pale and tired, but she refused to stop. The cabin outside was silent now. Passengers sat frozen, gripping armrests, whispering prayers, waiting for some sign that things would be okay. The man followed the co-pilot's instructions carefully, adjusting switches when told, keeping his voice calm even as the turbulence worsened. He didn't think of himself as brave. He was just doing what felt right. "Reduce speed," the controller said through the radio. "You're entering heavy clouds." The co-pilot adjusted the throttle, and the man watched as lightning flashed faintly in the distance. The sky was dark now, filled with gray layers of cloud. The plane trembled slightly as they entered the rough patch. "Stay calm," the co-pilot said, almost whispering it to himself. The man nodded, gripping the side of the console. "We're okay. Just a little rough air." For the next few minutes, the plane bounced through turbulence. The passengers cried out at every sudden drop, every shudder of the wings. But the co-pilot and the man kept working together, following the radio instructions step by step. Slowly, the shaking eased a little. They were still flying through dark clouds, but the plane was steady again. The co-pilot exhaled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Good job," he said quietly. The man gave a small nod. "Just tell me what's next." Back in the cabin, one of the attendants finally made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are being guided by air traffic control and preparing to land soon. Everything is under control." The tone of her voice, while still tense, brought a small sense of relief. People began to whisper softly, some even praying aloud. A few clapped when they realized the plane was flying smoothly again. Inside the cockpit, though, the work was far from over. The co-pilot looked over the readings. "We're still an hour out," he said. "If we hit another storm cell, it's going to be rough." The man leaned forward. "We'll make it. Just keep going." He said it with quiet confidence. It wasn't the kind of confidence that came from training. It came from belief. Belief that giving up wasn't an option. The co-pilot stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's bring everyone home." Outside, the storm clouds stretched far and wide, but somewhere beyond them, the faint outline of sunlight broke through. The man stared out at that light, his hands still trembling slightly, but his heart steady. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just a flight. It was a fight against fear, against time, and against the impossible. And as the engines roared against the wind, two strangers in the cockpit, one trained, one not, worked side by side, carrying the hopes of nearly 200 souls through the storm. The plane continued to glide through the thick gray clouds, its body shaking slightly every few minutes. Inside the cockpit, tension hung in the air like invisible weight. The co-pilot's hands moved swiftly over the controls, checking instruments, making small adjustments, doing everything he could to keep things steady. The man sitting beside him watched closely, ready to help when needed. He was calm on the outside, but inside his heart raced. He could hear it, steady, fast, and heavy. Every second felt stretched as if time had slowed down. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't a pilot, not really. But here he was, trying to help fly a massive passenger jet with hundreds of lives on board. "Keep your eyes on the horizon line," the co-pilot said, his voice low and steady. "If we lose balance, use the yoke gently. Don't fight the wind too hard. Let it guide you." The man nodded, his fingers brushing the controls lightly. "Got it," he replied. He didn't want to sound nervous, but his palms were sweaty. The radio crackled again. "Flight 227, this is Cityport Control. You're on course for an emergency landing. Maintain altitude and prepare for descent in 20 minutes. Ground teams are ready. How's the captain's condition?" The co-pilot looked back at the nurse, who was still by the captain's side, checking his pulse. "He's stable for now," she said softly, "but he hasn't regained consciousness." The co-pilot pressed the radio button. Still unconscious but breathing. "Passenger assisting. Requesting guidance for approach once we begin descent." "Copy that, Flight 227, you're doing great. Stay steady, and we'll bring you home." The man exhaled slowly, staring through the windshield at the endless sea of gray. Every now and then, lightning flashed somewhere in the distance, lighting up the clouds for a split second. It looked like the sky itself was alive. He swallowed hard. "I've flown small planes before," he said almost to himself. "But this feels completely different." The co-pilot glanced at him with a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's the same sky," he said quietly. "Just bigger wings," the man nodded. The words stuck with him. Same sky, just bigger wings. In the cabin behind them, people sat in silence. Some held hands, some whispered prayers, and others simply stared ahead, lost in their own thoughts. The sound of the engines was the only thing that reminded them they were still moving, still alive. A few rows back, a little boy clutched his toy airplane tightly. His mother whispered to him, "Everything's going to be okay." But even she didn't sound sure. The passengers didn't know exactly what was happening, but they could feel it. The weight of fear, the tension in the air, the way the flight attendants moved quickly and quietly, trying to hide their worry. The man in the cockpit looked down at the instrument panel. Numbers, lights, and dials blinked constantly. It was like trying to read a foreign language he once studied long ago, but somehow it was coming back. The lessons from his past. The way his old instructor used to say, "Flying isn't about fighting the plane, it's about trusting it." He remembered those words now. Trust the plane. Trust yourself. "Okay," the co-pilot said after a few minutes, his voice focused. "We're going to start our descent soon. I need you to help me monitor the altitude and speed. Tell me if either one drops too fast." "Understood," the man replied quickly, keeping his eyes fixed on the gauges. Outside, the storm clouds began to thin slightly. Patches of blue peeked through. It was a small relief, but still far from safe. The plane continued to shake, though less violently now. Suddenly, a faint groan came from behind. The nurse leaned over the captain. His fingers twitched slightly. "He's moving," she said quickly. The co-pilot turned for a second, hope flashing across his face. "Is he waking up?" The nurse nodded. "He's trying to," the man's heart lifted. Maybe things were finally turning around. But then the captain's head slumped again, his breathing uneven. The nurse sighed, shaking her head. "He's still too weak. I'll keep him stable." The co-pilot clenched his jaw. "All right. We keep going." The man swallowed, keeping his voice steady. "You've got this," he said quietly. The co-pilot nodded. "We've got this." For a few minutes, silence filled the cockpit except for the hum of the engines. Then the voice from air traffic control came again. "Flight 2I-27, begin descent to 10,000 feet. Weather is clearing near the airport, but expect strong crosswinds on approach." The co-pilot took a deep breath. "Roger that. Beginning descent." He turned a few switches and eased the yoke forward. The man felt the plane slowly tilt downward. His stomach tightened slightly as the plane began its long, careful drop through the clouds. "Altitude dropping," the man said, watching the numbers. 28,000. 26,000. "Good," the co-pilot replied. "Keep calling it out." They worked together in perfect rhythm. Two men who had never met before, united by one goal, to keep everyone alive. In the cabin, passengers could feel the change in motion. The seatbelt sign stayed on and the captain's voice didn't return. Some began crying softly. Others whispered things like, "We're landing and they've got this." The flight attendants moved slowly down the aisles, checking that everyone was buckled in. One of them paused near an elderly couple who looked frightened and held their hands. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, her voice trembling but kind. "They're bringing us down safely." The man in the cockpit could hear faint sounds from the cabin, the muffled cries, the quiet prayers. It only made his resolve stronger. He focused harder, listening carefully to the co-pilot's every instruction. "Speed steady," the man reported. "Good. Adjust flaps," the co-pilot said. "We're almost through the last layer of clouds." The man reached out, flipped the switch carefully, and felt the slight change in the plane's rhythm. The engines roared louder for a moment, then settled again. Then, for the first time in what felt like hours, sunlight broke through. The thick gray clouds opened up, revealing a stretch of blue sky and far below the faint outline of land. The sight made everyone breathe easier. "There it is," the co-pilot whispered. "The airport." The man leaned forward. The runway was still distant but visible. It looked so small, like a thin gray line in the middle of green fields. "Okay," the co-pilot said. "We're not out of danger yet. We've still got strong winds near the ground. I'll need your help keeping us level." "I'm with you," the man said. They began their final descent. The plane shuddered again as the crosswinds hit. The wings tilted slightly and the passengers gasped. The co-pilot gritted his teeth, his hands firm on the yoke. "Keep her steady," he muttered. "Come on, hold it." The man watched the horizon line carefully, ready to assist. He felt every shake, every movement deep in his chest. The radio crackled again. "Flight 227, winds at ground level are gusting from the southwest. Emergency crews are on standby. You are clear for runway 27. "Roger that," the co-pilot replied. The man's heartbeat quickened. The ground was closer now. He could see cars on the highway, tiny buildings, patches of trees. The sight felt both comforting and terrifying. It meant they were close, but it also meant there was no room for mistakes. "Flaps full," the co-pilot instructed. "Flaps full," the man repeated, adjusting the switch. "Speed? 150 knots and dropping. Good, hold it there." The man could feel sweat trickling down his back. The engines roared loudly as they aligned with the runway. The plane dipped slightly and the passengers braced themselves. Some closed their eyes. The co-pilot glanced at the man. "You ready?" He nodded. "Let's finish this." The ground rushed closer. The runway loomed larger with every passing second. The co-pilot's hands moved carefully, making tiny corrections. The man's eyes stayed locked on the horizon. "Almost there," the co-pilot whispered. The first bump came as the wheels touched down, a rough jolt that made everyone gasp. Then another. The plane bounced once, twice, before finally gripping the ground. The noise was deafening, the roar of the engines, the screech of the tires, but it was the most beautiful sound anyone had ever heard. The man's hands tightened around the seat as the plane sped down the runway, then slowly began to decelerate. The co-pilot pulled the throttle back, the engines whined, and finally the plane rolled to a stop. For a moment there was silence. No one spoke, no one moved. Then suddenly the cabin erupted in cheers. People clapped, cried, hugged each other. The man leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily. His hands were trembling now that it was over. The co-pilot turned toward him, eyes glassy with relief. "We did it," he whispered. The man gave a tired smile. "We did." The nurse behind them called out, "He's waking up!" Everyone turned toward the captain, who was now moving slightly, blinking as if waking from a long sleep. Paramedics were already rushing toward the aircraft outside. The sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance. As the engines powered down, the man looked out at the bright sunlight flooding the cockpit. It felt unreal. The fear, the storm, the shaking, it was all behind them now. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't even feel brave. He just felt grateful. Grateful to be alive, grateful that everyone had made it. The co-pilot reached over and shook his hand firmly. "You saved lives today," he said quietly. The man shook his head. "No," he replied softly, looking out the window at the runway glistening under the light. "We all did." And as the cheers from the cabin grew louder, the man finally allowed himself to breathe. The nightmare was over. The sky was calm again. The air inside the plane felt heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of fear. The passengers were still shaken, whispering prayers, gripping their seats, and looking toward the cockpit door with worried eyes. The once peaceful flight had turned into something none of them could ever imagine. Inside the cockpit, the situation was tense. The co-pilot's forehead was covered in sweat as he tried to manage the controls. The pilot was still unconscious, slumped back in his seat while the nurse continued trying to help him. Daniel sat beside the co-pilot, his hands shaking slightly, but his mind was focused. He wasn't a professional pilot, yet at that moment, he was the only one who could make a difference. The radio crackled with the calm but urgent voice of the air traffic controller. "Stay calm, you're doing great," the voice said. "Keep the wings level and reduce your speed a little." "You're handling it well." Daniel swallowed hard. "Roger that," he replied softly, trying to keep his voice steady. His heart was beating fast and his palms were damp, but his focus didn't break. Every time the plane trembled, every beep from the control panel reminded him that hundreds of lives depended on what he did next. The co-pilot looked at him, his voice shaking. "We're heading toward rough weather. It's forming ahead. I can see it on the radar." Daniel took a deep breath. "Then we go around it," he said, though he wasn't completely sure how. He remembered his old flight lessons, the feel of small planes, the way his instructor had told him never to fight the wind. Just work with it. He tried to apply those lessons now, even though the stakes were beyond anything he'd faced. In the cabin, people were starting to panic again as turbulence hit. The lights flickered for a moment and luggage compartments rattled. A mother tried to calm her crying child. The flight attendants moved quickly, helping people fasten their seatbelts tighter and reassuring them that help was on the way. Their voices trembled, but they didn't stop. Back in the cockpit, Daniel tried to keep his breathing steady. "Altitude holding?" he asked. "Just barely," the co-pilot said, adjusting a few switches. "If we can make it another 100 miles, we'll be in range of the emergency runway." The radio came alive again. "Flight 782, we're clearing the path for you. Stay on heading 270. You're doing well. Emergency crews are ready at the airport." Hearing those words gave Daniel a spark of hope. For the first time since stepping into the cockpit, he felt a small sense of control. He glanced at the unconscious pilot and whispered quietly, "Hang in there, sir. We're getting you home." But the storm ahead didn't care about their hopes. Clouds loomed large in front of them, dark and restless. The wind started to push against the aircraft, tossing it slightly to the side. The sound of rain hitting the fuselage grew louder, and lightning flashed in the distance. The co-pilot clenched the control column. "We're going through it," he said grimly. "There's no way around in time." Daniel nodded. "Then we go steady. No sudden moves." The plane shuddered violently as they entered the storm. People screamed in the cabin. Overhead bins rattled again and a cup rolled down the aisle. Daniel tightened his grip on the control, his knuckles turning white. Every instinct told him to panic, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Altitude stable?" the air traffic controller asked. Daniel's voice cracked slightly as he answered, trying to keep it at 20,000. "Good job," came the reply. "You're almost clear of the storm. Stay with me." The plane jolted again, and for a brief moment Daniel thought they were losing control. But then, like a break in a nightmare, the clouds began to thin. The sky brightened a little and the wind softened. The worst was over. The co-pilot let out a shaky breath and looked at Daniel. "You did it," he said quietly. "You actually did it." Daniel didn't smile. He was too focused, too aware that the hardest part was still ahead, the landing. He looked at the co-pilot. "How much fuel left?" The co-pilot glanced at the gauge. "Not much. We've got just enough to reach the emergency strip." The nurse's voice came from behind them. "He's breathing a little better, but still unconscious. I think he might have had a stroke." Daniel turned slightly. "You've done an incredible job," he said softly. "Just keep him stable. We'll get him down soon." The nurse nodded, her face pale but determined. Minutes later, the radio voice returned, calmer now but firm. "Flight 782, you're 15 miles out. Begin your descent slowly. Remember, keep your approach shallow, speed at 210 knots. We'll guide you all the way." Daniel nodded, repeating the instructions aloud. His hands moved carefully on the controls. He could see the ground now, far below, tiny patches of land and a thin strip that must have been the runway. It didn't look big enough for something this massive, but it was all they had. In the cabin, the passengers felt the plane tilt downward. Some held hands, others closed their eyes. Every second felt endless. The co-pilot adjusted the flaps and checked the landing gear. "Gear down," he said, pulling the lever. The heavy thump from below signaled the landing wheels were in place. Daniel's breathing quickened. The runway was closer now. His mind replayed everything he'd ever learned, Smooth adjustments, no sudden turns, keep the nose level. The air traffic controller's calm voice continued, guiding him gently. Looking good, Flight 782. You're on the glide path. You're doing great. Just a few hundred feet more. The engines roared as Daniel reduced power slightly. The plane trembled, then steadied. He could see fire trucks and ambulances waiting on the ground, red lights flashing in the distance. Easy, said the co-pilot, his eyes locked on the runway. Hold her steady. That's it. You've got it. The plane dropped lower and lower. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat louder than the engines now. He whispered under his breath, Please stay steady. Then, with a heavy thud, the wheels hit the ground. The plane bounced once hard, then came down again. Daniel pressed the brakes, feeling the vibration through the floor. The co-pilot helped, applying reverse thrust. The engines screamed, the passengers cried out, but the speed began to drop. After what felt like forever, the aircraft finally slowed to a stop. Silence filled the cabin. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then someone started clapping. Another joined. Soon the entire cabin was filled with applause, cheers, and tears. Daniel leaned back in his seat, shaking from exhaustion. The co-pilot looked at him, speechless. You saved us, the co-pilot finally said. You really saved us, Daniel shook his head. No, we all did this together. As the paramedics rushed inside to help the unconscious pilot, Daniel stepped aside to let them work. He watched quietly as they lifted the man onto a stretcher. The nurse who had been helping smiled faintly through tears. He's breathing stronger now, she said. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, overwhelmed. He could hear the passengers still clapping, still crying, still thanking the heavens. When the plane doors opened, cool air rushed in. The smell of rain mixed with relief. Emergency workers stood ready, guiding everyone to safety. Daniel walked out last, staying behind to make sure everyone else got off first. The moment he stepped onto the runway, his knees felt weak. The air traffic controller, who had been guiding him through it all, ran up to him. You did something extraordinary, the man said, gripping his shoulder. You kept your head when it mattered most. Daniel looked back at the plane, its engines quiet now, and shook his head slowly. I was just trying to get everyone home, he said softly. The controller smiled. Well, you did. And you did it better than most trained pilots could have under that kind of pressure. As the passengers reunited with loved ones and the media began to gather in the distance, Daniel slipped away quietly. He didn't want cameras or interviews. He just wanted to breathe again. He sat on the curb near an emergency vehicle looking up at the sky. It was clearing now, soft sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time since that terrifying moment when the pilot collapsed, Daniel allowed himself to feel everything, the fear, the exhaustion, and the relief that they had all survived. One of the crew members came over, still emotional. You should be proud, she said gently. You gave everyone a second chance today. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Maybe, he said. But honestly, I'm just grateful we made it. And as he looked back at the airplane, now silent and safe, he realized that sometimes courage doesn't come from strength or training. It comes from the moment when someone decides not to give up, even when they're scared. That day, an ordinary passenger had done something no one expected, and while the world would soon call him a hero, Daniel only thought of it as what any human being should do when life puts them in the pilot's seat, even for a moment. The sun was slowly setting over the airport when the chaos began to calm down. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles reflected on the wet runway, and the sound of engines finally faded into the distance. Inside the terminal, people were still shaking, crying, hugging, and calling their loved ones. Some sat quietly staring at their phones, still trying to process what had just happened. Daniel sat on a bench near the gate, his shirt damp with sweat and his hands still trembling. His heart was finally slowing down, but his mind was still replaying every second of what happened in that cockpit. The alarms, the storm, the shaking, and the moment the wheels finally hit the ground. He could still feel the vibration through his feet. A flight attendant came over, holding 2 cups of water. She sat beside him and handed him one. You need this, she said softly. You've been running on pure adrenaline. He gave a small smile, barely lifting his eyes. Thank you. I still can't believe it's over, she nodded. You were incredible. None of us would be here if you hadn't stepped up. Daniel didn't know what to say. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt tired, confused, and a little lost. I didn't even think, he said quietly. Did what I had to do, she smiled faintly. That's usually what heroes say. Before he could reply, a nurse came running up to them. It was the same woman who had stayed beside the pilot the whole time. Her eyes were red but filled with relief. He's stable, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. They took him to the hospital and the doctors think he's going to make it. Daniel felt a weight lift off his chest. For the first time since that terrifying moment when the pilot collapsed, he finally allowed himself to breathe deeply. That's the best news I've heard all day, he said. The nurse nodded, tears forming again. You saved him too. You gave us the chance to get him help. He shook his head gently. You saved him. You never stopped trying. We all just held on together. Word of what had happened had already started spreading through the terminal. Passengers were talking, showing videos they had recorded during the landing. Some reporters were gathering near the gate, holding microphones and cameras, waiting to speak to the man who had helped land the plane. But Daniel didn't want that. He didn't want to be the center of attention or the face of a headline. He had never been that kind of person. He stood up quietly, hoping to slip away before the media could find him. But before he could, a group of passengers saw him and started clapping. One by one, others joined in, their voices echoing through the hall. Some were crying, others smiling through tears. It wasn't the loud, chaotic applause from earlier. It was soft, heartfelt, full of gratitude. Daniel froze, overwhelmed. A child ran up to him and hugged his leg. Her mother followed, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. You gave my daughter back to me. Daniel's throat tightened. He crouched down, smiling gently at the little girl. You were very brave up there, he said softly. I saw you holding your mom's hand the whole time. You helped her be strong too. The mother smiled through her tears. You don't know what you did for all of us. As more people gathered, he realized there was no escaping the moment. He didn't know what to say to all those faces looking at him with gratitude and disbelief. So he just nodded humbly and said, I'm just glad everyone's safe. That's all that matters. The airline staff came soon after, thanking him, shaking his hand, and telling him they would be contacting him officially later. Someone mentioned that the company wanted to honor him publicly, maybe even give him a medal. But Daniel wasn't thinking about awards. He just wanted to sit quietly and let his mind rest. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh, washed clean by the storm. Daniel stepped out onto the curb near the terminal and looked up at the sky. It was streaked with shades of pink and gold, the kind of sunset that made the whole world feel peaceful again. A voice called behind him. It was the co-pilot. He looked more composed now, though his eyes were tired and red. He walked up slowly and stood beside Daniel in silence for a moment. Then he said quietly, I still can't believe what happened up there. Daniel nodded. Neither can I. You know, the co-pilot continued, when the captain went down, I thought it was over. I've trained for emergencies, but nothing prepares you for seeing that happen in front of you. And then you walked in. You were calm when everyone else was losing it. Daniel gave a small laugh. I wasn't calm. I was terrified. I just didn't let it show. The co-pilot smiled faintly. That's what makes a good pilot. They stood quietly for a while, watching the last of the sunset fade. Then the co-pilot turned to him. They'll want to talk to you, news, airlines, everyone. But whatever you decide, I just want you to know something. You saved 180 people today. You didn't just fly the plane, you gave everyone hope. Daniel looked at him and said softly, I didn't do it alone. The co-pilot nodded. No, but you were the one who believed it could be done when the rest of us were frozen. After a few moments, the co-pilot was called away to give a report, leaving Daniel standing there. He felt the cool breeze against his face and closed his eyes for a second, letting everything sink in. Later that night, Daniel checked into a small hotel near the airport. He didn't want to go online or watch the news. He just wanted silence. He took a long shower, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared out the window at the distant lights of the runway. His phone buzzed. Messages from strangers, reporters, even friends he hadn't heard from in years. Everyone wanted to talk to him, but Daniel didn't reply. He wasn't ready to turn what had happened into a story for the world. He finally lay down, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes. The blinking cockpit lights, the storm clouds, the terrified faces of the passengers. But mixed with those images was the sound of the landing gear hitting the runway, the applause afterward, and the feeling of relief when the plane stopped. It wasn't a dream he'd ever wanted to live through, but he knew it had changed him forever. The next morning, when he woke up, the news had already gone viral. His picture was everywhere. Passenger turned hero. Headlines calling him the man who did the impossible. But Daniel didn't rush to read them. Instead, he called the hospital to check on the pilot. The nurse who answered told him the pilot was awake and asking about the flight. Hearing that made Daniel smile. He decided to visit. When he arrived at the hospital, the pilot was sitting up in bed looking pale but alive. His eyes lit up when he saw Daniel. "You're the man who kept my bird in the sky," the pilot said weakly, his voice still rough. Daniel smiled shyly. "I just did what I could. We were lucky." The pilot shook his head slowly. "That wasn't luck. That was courage. You saved my crew, my passengers, and my plane. I can't thank you enough." Daniel sat down beside him. "You've spent your life keeping people safe in the air. I just returned the favor for one flight." The pilot laughed softly. "You've got the heart of a flyer. Maybe you should finish those lessons someday." Daniel smiled. "Maybe I will." They talked for a while, and when Daniel finally left, the pilot reached out and shook his hand firmly. "You gave everyone a second chance," he said. "That's not something anyone forgets." Outside, Daniel paused by a window, watching a plane take off in the distance. The engines roared, the wheels lifted, and it climbed gracefully into the sky. He thought about all the people who'd been with him on that flight, the fear they shared, the way strangers became a team when it mattered most. For the rest of his life, that moment would stay with him. Not as a story of fame or heroism, but as a reminder of what ordinary people are capable of when life tests them in unexpected ways. He didn't care about awards or interviews. What mattered most to him was that 180 souls went home that night. Families were reunited, tears turned into smiles, and fear became faith again. And as he watched that plane disappear into the clouds, Daniel whispered to himself, "We all made it. That's enough." Then he turned and walked away, the sound of engines fading behind him. But the memory of that flight and what it taught him about courage and humanity would never fade.